Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to rebuild your inner air chamber on your WP AER and Exact forks. These WP AER 48s and the Exact forks are found on many KTM and Husky bikes out there. They're great forks, but they do need to be maintained to keep that good performance. So with these, what can happen is you have some seals in that air chamber. If they fail, you can actually get air into the outer chamber, and then you keep pumping up the inner one, and you're gonna have way too much pressure in there, and these are gonna feel really harsh. That's what's going on with ours. Another issue you could run into is there's another seal in that air chamber that can fail, and as the forks compress, they can actually stay slightly compressed or go all the way down. So if you're having either of those problems, we're going to show you how to get that taken care of. And this process is going to be similar for the WP AER 48s and again, the Exact forks. So let's go ahead and jump into this. To do this job, you're going to need some common hand tools along with some specialty tools. So things I want to point out are this 50mm fork cap wrench. This one is from Tusk and it's made specifically for the KTM and Husky bikes. We also have a suspension air pump, 14mm Allen socket, ratio right, drain pan. We have a Race Tech shaft holding tool and a vise. As far as parts and consumables go, we have our suspension cleaner, we have the fork fluid, Race Tech seal grease. This is the seal kit for the WP AER air forks. Now this is going to come with stuff like the O-ring for your fork cap, but it does not come with the internal seals on that air chamber. That's what these are. They're sold individually. This one's going to come with that snap ring, as well as has a little bushing right here. It comes on there. And then we're also going to be using rubber gloves, safety glasses, and some rags. Now for our fork, we've already removed this from the bike. If you need help doing that, you want to refer to your model specific service manual, and you also want to refer to that manual throughout the process for more information and specs. Now, one thing I do want to point out, when you're removing this fork from the bike, you want to loosen the upper two pinch bolts on your triple clamp and then loosen this fork cap up while it's still clamped in the bottom triple clamp. That's just going to make it a lot easier. So once you have this over at the vise, we have this clamped in our suspension soft jaws. What we're going to do is remove this vent bolt for the outer chamber. So this one is not supposed to be pressurized. It's just going to let atmospheric air pressure out. But if you happen to have a bad seal, then you're going to hear a ton of pressure coming out from here. So once that's all vented out, I'm just going to tighten this back up. And then I'm going to remove the cap for the Schrader valve, and I'm going to release that pressure. So once you've done that, I'm actually going to remove the Schrader valve all the way. So once we've done that, we're going to go ahead and loosen up this fork cap all the way and dump this oil into our drain pan. All right, so at this point, I'm going to temporarily screw this cap back on. And I'm going to clamp the lower axle holder in the soft jaws. Now on the bottom of the fork, we're going to have a rubber cap, and I'm just going to use a flat blade screwdriver to remove that. Then we have a 19mm center bolt. I'm going to crack that loose and make sure you have a drain pan underneath to catch any residual oil. And then we can remove our inner air chamber, and we're going to lay it out on some clean rags. At this point, we can go ahead and remove our fork tubes from the vise. Now, with this air chamber, I'm just going to quickly spray the oil off of it with some suspension clean. Once you've done that, you want to inspect this O-ring on the fork cap and check if it's in good condition, if there's any flat spots or it's or if it's torn, you definitely want to replace it. Really, it's a good practice to replace it anytime this cap is off. So once you've done that, we're gonna actually clamp this in our soft jaws, and we're just gonna clamp it down really light. You don't wanna damage this. And I do wanna point out, there is a little mark that is intentionally on this chamber. You do not wanna damage this. Don't clamp around this area. So we're actually gonna go closer to the end when we clamp this down. So I have this lightly clamped in here. We have a snap ring that we need to remove, and we also have a bushing underneath that. So I'm gonna use a pick and a small flat blade screwdriver to remove this snap ring. Now to get the seal head off, you are gonna have to heat this area right by the seal head and get it nice and hot, and then this should break free pretty easy. But we're gonna raise this chamber up in the vise just a little bit. To do that, just keep in mind that you don't wanna clamp down on this notch. Now I do want to point out, if this is not hot enough, this seal head will not come loose. And when you're loosening this up, if it binds up on you, you might have to heat this up again. Once it's loosened up all the way, you might want to let this cool down just a little bit, and then you can go ahead and remove the complete piston rod assembly. This end is going to be greased up. Now we can remove this tube. Now real quick, before we go any further, I just want to give a brief explanation of how this air chamber works. So right here you can see this upper seal. So this normally sits just above that crossover point on this tube, but as soon as you start pumping this up, it's going to let a little pressure build, and then this top out spring is actually going to compress a little bit. It's going to let this top pressure equalize with, you could call this a balance chamber. So what that's going to do, it's going to let pressure down here, and that pressure is going to go through this small orifice all the way down into this piston rod. There's an O-ring down here where this center bolt goes on, and you're probably not going to have any issues with that, but if you can't get this thing to work right, you may want to change out that O-ring as well. So the main thing with this, if your fork is stuck in the collapsed position, then it's probably going to be this upper seal. And then if you keep having air pressure enter into the outer chamber of your fork, it's probably going to be this lower seal. Now, even though it might just be one of your seals that is bad and causing your problem, while you're in here, it's a good idea to replace both of these seals, and that way you're going to prevent future issues down the road. And if one of these seals is bad, there's a good chance the second one is on its way out. So the next thing we're going to do is wipe some of this grease from this upper seal. Then we're going to remove our bushing, and I'm actually going to cut the seal off. That's going to allow us to heat this aluminum piece up and make it easier to remove. Next, I'm going to take the Racetech shaft holding tool, and I'm going to set it down into the vise. Now we'll take the shaft, and you want to make sure your seal is slid down, because you want to clamp it as close to the top as you can. And this plastic piece, this one's not coming down. Once you have that tightened down, we'll go ahead and heat this piece on top up. You don't want to heat this plastic and melt it. Now once you've let everything cool down, we're going to remove this piston shaft from our special tool, and we're going to remove this top out spring, and then we'll remove this seal. And last, I'm going to show you the O-ring that's in this piston rod cap. Again, most likely you probably won't have to change this out, but just in case someone does, We just have a 19 millimeter wrench and a 24 millimeter box end. Loosen that up. So you can see we just have this yellow O-ring down there in the bottom. Now with everything disassembled, we'll use some suspension clean to clean all these parts up. All right, now that we have everything cleaned up, I'm going to apply some grease to this O-ring. Now, I do want to point out this O-ring, if it was bad, then you're just going to have to find one that's the same size. KTM does not offer an individual replacement for this one. You're going to have to buy that whole piston rod or just find a match to this. So I'm going to apply some grease to that O-ring. We'll stick it back into that piston rod cap. And then I'm going to make sure the jam nut is backed up all the way on this piston rod. And I'll screw this into place. You want to go until this cap bottoms out. So I can feel that just bottomed out and there's a little gap between the jam nut and the cap. So that's exactly what we want. I'm going to screw the jam nut down against the cap and then we'll tighten them together. Next, we're going to take the piston rod and put it back into the shaft holding tool. Then once that's clamped down, before we install any seals on this, I'm going to cover these threads with just a little bit of electrical tape. That way it doesn't cut our new seals when we put them on. So once you've done that, what I'm going to do is you can use an acid brush or a little screwdriver. You want to apply just a little bit of grease to these new seals. And this is the suspension grease. We can go ahead and slide the seal onto the shaft. I'm just going to work it on carefully so we don't tear anything. And once that's in place, we can remove this tape. Next, we're going to install the top out spring. Next, I want to make sure that these threads are clean and don't have any grease on them. So I'm just going to take some suspension cleaner, spray them off one last time. Then we can take our plastic spacer. We're going to set that in place. Then I'm going to move this piston shaft. I'm going to move it back down so we can install that top seal. So you can see these new parts, they do come with some Loctite on them, but since it's already dry, it's not really going to bond with this shaft. So one thing I'm going to do is just put a drop of high strength thread lock in there just to make sure we have a good bond between both parts. Then we'll go ahead and tighten down our new top seal. Then we'll go ahead and torque it. Next, we're going to grease up this upper seal. Now, you might have noticed when you removed this piston rod from that chamber that there's quite a bit of grease globbed on top. We're just going to do the same thing. There is a specific grease in the service manual, but we found that the Racetech seal grease works great for this. So we're just going to go ahead and put some on there. So now I'm going to take the piston rod and we're going to reinstall this into the chamber. The one thing I'm going to do is slide down the lower seal all the way. That way when I slide this in, we're going to get a little bit of grease on these threads that this Loctite is supposed to seal against, and Loctite won't seal correctly against the grease. So I'm going to take a rag and a little bit of suspension cleaner and get that grease out of there. Now to install this lower seal, I'm going to do the same thing and just apply a little bit of Loctite to it. And we'll go ahead and slide this into place and tighten it down. We're going to do the final tightening in the vise, but Before you do the final tightening, I'm just going to screw this most of the way in, and then you see the O-ring that's exposed still. As soon as the threads are down most of the way, I'm going to apply a little bit of grease to that O-ring. Once we've done that, we'll go ahead and install our plastic collar and our new snap ring. Next, we're going to install our Schrader valve and pump up the fork to the specified air pressure, and that way we can check our work. Once you've done that, you can install your Schrader valve cap and your new O-ring. And we put just a little bit of grease on that O-ring. From here, we're going to take our fork tubes and we'll clamp the axle holder back into our soft jaws. At the bottom of this axle holder, it actually has a fitting that this cap for this piston rod sits into. So you want to make sure that's all lined up. So you can stick one finger in there and rotate this until it actually drops into place. Once that's in place, I'm going to apply a little bit of grease to the O-ring on the center bolt, and we'll hold on to that air chamber while we install this, and we'll torque it to spec. Now we can install the rubber plug in the bottom of our axle holder. I'm going to remove the fork from the vise, and I've already measured out the correct amount of oil to pour down in here. So we're just going to fill this up. Then we can slide the outer tube up and we'll tighten down our fork cap. You're probably going to have to do the final tightening once the fork is actually back in the triple clamps. All right, that's it. That's all there is to rebuilding the inner air chamber on your WP AER or Exact forks. If you need these parts, check out our website. They're going to be under the OEM diagrams. And for more content like this, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.